What's the number one piece of advice that you'd give a founder in their early stages? What would be that message?
Know who you're talking to, why they should care, and then deliver them an authentic message and tell a good story that's true to you. At the end of the day, what you're trying to do. And it's so easy to lose track of that. When somebody asks you, hey, what do you do? Or what's your pitch? You have to take the time beforehand to know what that is that you're going to say and practice it so that when they ask that question, you don't have to think through all those steps again in the moment. You've already done the work and you know exactly what you're going to say. You can do it cold. And that's going to be memorable and repeatable.
Dorothy Chang, welcome to the show. Nice to see you. How are you?
Nice to see you. I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing well. So we met, I'm going to say like 3-4 months ago.
Yeah.
It was Q4, I'm pretty sure. I went to, living in the New York City metro area, I went to a tech startup event of founders, and you were there and you were working the room. And we all were, but you were a master. And we had a wonderful conversation. And I thought to myself, I'm going to be starting a podcast soon, and I want Dorothy to be on that podcast. Well, here you are. So
it's good to be here.
Yeah. So share with me your journey. So you've done some really amazing things and you shared some of that when I met you, but tell the audience, what's your journey look like and how'd you get to where you are now?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been working in the tech startup world in New York City for the past 20 years, ever since I graduated from college. I started in PR and worked with a lot of amazing, huge brands like IBM and Fujifilm and Microsoft and Samsung across different agencies. But within the first couple of years, I kind of fell in love with the startup world. I started working with a small client, realized how much more of an impact I could have and how much more exciting it was for me to work on brand new, innovative products that had never been seen before. So that's when I got the startup bug pretty early on, and I've had it ever since. So I've played a number of different roles since then, from PR, building my own agency, starting a venture capital seed fund, investing in blockchain technologies, running marketing at Paxos, a blockchain infrastructure company, to running Code with Classy as president. It's a nonprofit coding summer camp founded by Carly Kloss, the supermodel and entrepreneur. And so I've done a bunch of different things in the tech world. And currently am a co-founder of Lynx Collective, which is a community for tech startups in New York. We put on programming and connect people with resources and investors and try to help everyone get a little bit further along. And the other thing I do is I'm an investor. I'm an investment partner with Next Wave New York City, which is a pre-seed fund backed by Flybridge Capital. And we're looking at investing in the most innovative startups in New York. That's kind of in a nutshell.
Hence why I met you at a startup networking event on a rooftop in New York City.
That's right.
That's great. You've done a lot. That's impressive.
I have ADHD, which helps or hurts. I don't know. But it means that, it's part of the reason why I think I'm naturally kind of drawn to the startup world and what's new and different and change. And that's what really, kind of excites me and moves me forward.
Yeah. So you know that the name of this podcast is How to Unfuck Your Startup. And the reason it's called that, partly I want it to be provocative, but my whole career, similar to yours, has been very heavily involved in the startup world, where I come in as a chief revenue officer and I'm told, hey, Dan, we'd love you to come in and help us get to the next level. And what I learn every time is that there's a lot of dysfunction, a tremendous amount. And I have to unfuck it, so to speak. And so when I thought about what do I want to talk about, I want to talk about what I know, which is how do you help these companies, how do you help these founders figure out their situation so that they can succeed and achieve their goals. You've seen it all. And working in the startup world, you probably see quite a bit of dysfunction. If you wouldn't mind, Dorothy, share a story or two, leave out proper nouns and proper names because we want to keep it relatively confidential. But what are you seeing? Give me some examples of some fucked up stuff that you've seen along the way.
I mean, some of the really, most uncomfortable, fucked up things that I've seen are things that I've worked on as a, PR marketer, PR executive or marketer, right? Where I'm trying not to let those stories get told. So, but I can share some of them, a little bit, I guess, anonymously, if you will. And most of them aren't that terrible, but some of the stuff that happens in it is really, are things that are totally out of your control, right? So, for example, I worked with a startup where we got regularly accusations from the media about our very private data being exposed publicly. And it wasn't true, right? But we got these accusations because people would try to hack into the system and put together these databases of information that they scraped off the web, sell it on the dark web, and then, if they didn't get any takers, then they would take it to the press and try to make these accusations go public so that they would get some kind of bounty for, learning from those hackers what went wrong and how to fix it. But but it was never true, right? They were just scraping data off of the web. They weren't actually accessing anything private. So we did a lot of damage control from that perspective of just having to deal with the media, having strong enough relationships with the media to be able to say, hey, don't publish anything yet. Let's look into this. Let me understand what you think you have. And let me dig a little bit and give you the real information. And 9 times out of 10, we prevented a story from going out because it just simply wasn't true. But this is the kind of thing that you really can't control. And when you're a small startup and you don't have a lot of resources and you've never gone through that experience before, that's really challenging. And it could be really damaging if you don't handle it correctly. So, that's the kind of thing that can be really scary and can be existential for a startup, and not the kind of thing you went into the startup building journey of your life to do, right? That's not what you're in it for. So there's all kinds of kind of crazy things that can happen that you have no control over, that can fuck you up in a bunch of ways. And that's the thing that I think can be really challenging about the media is that when something's out there and it's in the press, no matter whether it's true or not, that can be very damaging to your reputation and it can be very hard to crawl back from that. Another story, there is, I'm not going to go into exactly what the product was, but there's some kind of product. They did a huge influencer campaign, and it just hit the wrong note, right? It made it, for some reason, the way that they use these influencers, the way they spent their money on it, it came off as very inauthentic. And that caused a problem, not just for their own startup, but all the other products in that same category, because it kind of got the backlash or backsplash, right, from that situation categorically. That's something that's totally out of your control too. Now, there are a lot of things that are in your control that you can also fuck up in a startup, no doubt. But those are some of the growing pains of a small brand. You don't have the reputation yet to stand on, then it can be really hard to come back from something negative.
I'll bet, for sure. I'm glad you brought that up because I haven't thought of that kind of a outside of your organization issue causing you problems and you have no control over that, nor did you anticipate it coming. You mentioned that a lot of the issues that startups suffer from are, internal, started by themselves, like they don't tell the right story. And we'll talk about storytelling because I know you're great at it. Or maybe their operation wasn't very sound. Maybe the software had some glitches and bugs and problems and customers were upset. These are all things that you can fix, you can anticipate. How do you advise your startups to handle or to be, what would you tell a startup knowing what you know that can happen from the outside? How would you advise them for these types of examples that you gave? Because I wouldn't know what to do on a situation like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is being from the start. It's setting things up correctly from the beginning, right? So there's a lot of missteps that people can make as they're trying to grow a startup. They're trying to cut corners. They're trying to move fast. They're trying to, maybe come off a little bit bigger and more important seeming than they actually are. And there's a little bit of that that's always going to happen, and folks will toe the line on that. You're always trying to like position things in a good light. That's understandable. But people also have to, operate with integrity and make sure they're never crossing some of those bigger, brighter lines. And I think that's important for everybody to think deeply about where their values are, where they align, and who am I working with, whether you are a potential investor and a potential employee, partner, customer. Who is it that I'm working with, and do I trust them? Do I understand, the values of this person and who I'm aligning myself with, right? I think anybody involved at the very beginning of a startup needs to, have a deep understanding of who they're working with and what their goals are, and are they aligned in the right way. There has to be some amount of, operating manual or standard operating procedures, right? Like two co-founders need to understand they need to be on the same page about those things. And this is how we operate, and this is how we set up our company to be. For example, I worked at a company called Paxos, which is a blockchain infrastructure company. And from the very start, the whole mission of the company was to be a great blockchain infrastructure company that was regulated and always compliant, 100% always compliant. You're never gonna see an issue with Paxos with regulators. And that was very clear from the start. And that made it very distinct from most of the other companies in the crypto Web3 blockchain space. And that made it easy, really, for everybody to hew to what are the values of this company? What do we stand for? And how are we going to operate? We're always going to have a strong compliance function and a strong legal function. And publicly, we're always going to play nicely with policymakers and regulators. And that's going to dictate everything that we do. And that's how we're going to attract institutional dollars and large financial institutions as clients. There's no way they're going to work with us unless we are above board and, working on the same level as big banks do. So that was very clear. And if you work for almost any other crypto Web3 blockchain company, it might not be as clear, right? So you have to kind of understand where your lines are, what your guidelines are, what your values are, and make sure that everybody you're working with is on the same page. And then I think another part of that, which is somewhat related, is ensuring that you have the right corporate governance as well. We saw huge issues with companies like Theranos and FTX. They kind of flew too close to the sun, right? They had these huge blowups. And I think a big part of the problem is there wasn't the appropriate amount of corporate governance. There weren't the right adults in the room really paying attention to how this company is operating and making sure they weren't crossing certain lines. They were doing what they were saying they were doing. I think that's really important. And if you have that, then that's going to help make sure that you're not getting yourself in trouble. But also, when these big, scary things happen that are external to the company, you have somebody to call who knows what they're doing and can help you through those situations. So being armed with the right resources, the right community, the right access to the right people is very helpful to have on standby. because there's always going to be a sticky situation, and it's always helpful to talk to somebody who's been there and is not going through it at the moment. It's a lot harder when it's you in the hot seat. And once you've been through it, you can see it with clearer eyes.
Yep. So what I heard you say, especially at the beginning of your answer, was leadership from the top down. It was very clear to you when you came on board this company that this is the mandate. I know it, and everybody else in the company knows it. And it sounds like you had strong leadership, and leadership's vision and mission were very much about ethics, integrity, compliance, and that's great. And that is fantastic. And I think as we continue to discuss startups more, it's very important that the message come down from the top. Leadership has to make sure that everybody understands what the company's all about and why we're here, what the goals are, and that sort of thing. So you've worked for a lot of startups, but you also mentioned you've done quite a bit of investing. And I would love to know, tell the audience, what do you stay clear from? What do you run away from when you see these founders pitching you for money? I'd love to know a few of those, and your perspective is super helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think a lot of what is interesting is the same as what's interesting to a lot of investors in terms of, what's a transformative technology, what's a big market, where the trend's going in terms of the future and where are we moving towards versus where we've been. Where I stay away from is an interesting question. I feel like people don't ask that very often. I think there's something I saw yesterday which I was really scared by.
Tell us. Love it.
Because, so there's a solution. I'm not going to talk about exactly who it is or what it is, so I don't want to blow up anybody's spot, but basically it's a pre-seed company raising a couple $1 million, and at least half of that was earmarked for marketing spend. And most of that marketing spend was to be Facebook and Google ads, in an industry where I know they don't run those ads. They don't allow those ads.
They don't allow the ads?
Yeah. It's like a crypto company, right? Like they don't allow crypto ads, or, very small amount of crypto ads are allowed. And it's not for trading. It's not for buying and selling. It's, it might be for infrastructure. Maybe you might get by. But they're very strict with their compliance about those kinds of ads. So hearing him say, why would I make an investment in this company when I know they can't spend their funds the way they want to spend their funds?
Okay. So to me, you come asking me for money and you tell me that your use of funds includes running ads that you can't run on Facebook and Google.
Exactly. Yeah, run.
You don't know what you're doing.
Exactly.
I'd be like, you know what? You don't know what you're doing. I don't want to invest in a company or in a founder who doesn't know what they're doing.
Exactly. So, wow. I mean, that's a really egregious.
That's a rookie mistake.
Yeah. I mean, it's nowhere near. But I think, there's a bunch of other kind of red flags. Maybe that would be a little bit more common. So, for example, with this crew, it's like none of them are marketers on the team, but most of their deck was about these marketing campaigns that they wanted to run. This doesn't make any sense. And conversely, you'll see the same thing where, the team is all business and no technical skills. And the spend that they want to do is they want to spend all of their funds on hiring a technical team to build this thing that they have an idea for. That doesn't make sense either, for the same reasons. I'm not going to invest in you spending my money. I mean, not my money. I invest for a fund, but I'm not going to invest in you to spend this money on something you don't know anything about. You have to show that you know what you're doing and that use of funds is going to go somewhere it should go, and it's going to be used the right way and efficiently and with expertise, not for your experimentation in an area you don't know anything about, right? So I think, generally speaking, what we like to see is a team that shows that they have a unique insight about something. They've built something that proves that they can make magic with very little, right? They can, whether that's building a product or they've figured out some very clever, way of distributing that product. They can show traction, and adding money to it is going to help scale, not help figure out the problem from the very beginning of what it is that they're going to do. They have to demonstrate that it's going somewhere and there's something to believe in.
So super helpful. I want to get to storytelling here, and I want to tell a story in order to talk about storytelling. So around the time that I met you, I went to a cocktail party startup networking event. And when you walked in the door, you wore either a green tag, a red tag, or a blue tag, and each was for either a founder, an investor, or something else. And so, because I invest in startups here and there, I decided I'm going to wear an investor tag tonight, and I did. I might as well have been meat hanging from a hook, because there were many, many founders in there. I would say there's probably close to 100 founders in the room. And as soon as they see my colored tag, all over me. 1 out of 10 had a decent pitch. The other 9 would come up to me and start talking about just super under the hood technical stuff. And I would literally put my hand up and say, stop. Do me a favor. Tell me what you solve and why that matters. And they'd be like, what? What do you mean? And they'd scratch their head. And they struggled with it. I would nurture and help them get it out. And then once they got it out, which usually only took them a minute or so, these are really smart individuals, many of them engineers. It's like an epiphany, like, oh my God, that felt so good. I said, yeah, you just basically told me what you guys are doing, but you approached it differently. You approached it from a problem solution standpoint, and look how easy it was to tell your story. And guess what? I get it. And I'm not an engineer. It was amazing. Storytelling is critical. So I'd love to talk about storytelling with you for a while, because I know you're really good about it. But I'd love to hear, what do you hear? I shared a story about what I hear regularly is just overcomplicating and going down the engineer road to explain what a company does and avoiding even the problem and the solution and why it matters. What do you hear? What doesn't work for you? What does work for you? And then give some advice to the audience about, here's like a couple things that you could or should be doing in order to tell a flawless story.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer your story question with a story answer.
Beautiful. How apropos.
So, back when I was in college, I studied cognitive science, which is all about how the mind works, using the methods across psychology, linguistics, philosophy, computer science, neuroscience. And what I focused my research on was how what you know affects the way you communicate. And what I learned from my research, which my research I conducted in college, so it's based on education. And the professors who had been in their positions for more years were worse at teaching those beginner one-on-one classes than the TAs and the first year professors and the very early career teachers. And so that was something that I thought was fascinating, and I expected, because we have a thing called theory of mind, which is our ability to understand what somebody else is thinking. And there's something called the curse of knowledge, which is, once you know something, it's very hard for you to unknow it or understand the mindset of somebody who doesn't know that information. And so I took that, and that's how I got my start in the communications industry, because I wanted to learn, how does this apply in the real world in the actual field of communications. And working in technology, it was very clear to me because I over and over throughout my career have experienced exactly what you did that night, which is that people that have built something have a really hard time talking about it to people who don't know anything about what that person built. You're too close to it, right? You're too involved and you know it so well that you cannot imagine the perspective of somebody who doesn't have that same base knowledge as you. So when somebody says, oh my gosh, I was able to transmit this much information at this speed, and I'm, your average layman is like, so who cares? Why is that important? That sounds so boring. Because we don't know what that means. We don't know the implications of that. We don't know that that means that, what you've just accomplished is making data transfer across the world, a million times faster and more cheaply and more efficiently than it's done today. And the entirety of the internet can be downloaded in a millisecond. Okay, if you put it in those words, that sounds a lot different, right? The why, like you said to those people, the why is so much more important. The impact of what you're doing, why should anybody care, is why it's interesting. The what you're doing and the how and the actual speeds and feeds is not as interesting to your average person. It may be interesting to the people that are exactly in that industry and your potential partners and your potential customers. Some pieces of that are going to be interesting, but to a broader audience and to an investor who is not as deep in that space as you, it's not. So I think that's the thing that's really hard to do as a technologist, as a product manager, as an engineer, is talk about the work that you do in a way that a technologist, non-engineer, non-product manager is going to understand. And when you're a founder, you're not used to translating what you're doing to so many different stakeholders. You've got investors, you've got customers, you've got employees, you've got partners, vendors, and many of these constituencies you've never worked directly with before. And so now you're doing that for the first time, and the message you have to share, the story you have to tell, is totally different for each one. And I think people really underestimate how much of a difference it can make to hone that message and practice it too. A lot of founders are not practicing it. They're not taking the time, and they don't know how big of a difference that could make.
So first of all, love it. Love the story. I'll share with you an approach that I've been using for a while now. It's actually an exercise that I do with my team, but I'm going to differentiate message from delivery. So the first thing that we do in this exercise is we figure out what is the message? What is the company's value proposition? It's the what we solve, why it matters, and then quantify, if you can, the impact that it could have or the outcome that it could have. That's the table stakes. But you might find yourself talking to a myriad of different constituents or people or types, customers, analysts. It could be investors. It could be the Uber driver. So I create a spreadsheet matrix where we first start off with, here's the message. And then I say, okay, let's start with constituent number one, engineers. These are the people that may be buying the product or maybe evaluating the product. We're talking about software as a service. So there's usually an engineer that's got to evaluate it. What are the hot buttons? And we put the hot buttons for that profile engineer into the spreadsheet. And then what's the version of the story that you want to tell that person? And then you do the same thing for the finance person. Maybe there's a product person involved. What are their hot buttons? How do you tell that version of the story? And then you come up to, and I always put it on there to show perspective, the Uber driver. Oftentimes I'll be at the airport, I'll hop into an Uber, conversation gets going, usually starts with the weather, and it ends up with, so what do you do for a living? And my answer is software. Done. Ends the rest of the conversation. Because maybe I don't want to have a whole conversation about what I do with the Uber driver. Nevertheless, sometimes I do. And I'll say, oh, and I'll give a different version of the story. I bring this up because you basically just said the storytelling is important, but there's different people who you tell it to. So I'm curious, at Lynx or where you do your coaching and your advising, what do you tell your founders or your students? Yeah. What do you tell your students?
Founders, yeah, yeah.
Along the lines of, your story needs to be crisp and clear and simple and easy, and coming from the education that you just shared. How do you help them tell the story the right way to different people without necessarily changing the story? It's just a different delivery of the same story.
That's right. I think that the way you talk about that matrix is a great way to get started and to kind of delineate who are all those different constituents that I need to talk to. How is the message the same? How is the message different? And what does the delivery look like? And very tactically in that delivery bucket too, you might literally say, how is that message being delivered, through what channel, what media? But in terms of like how we tell that story, I think there's a few pieces that you might want to create first that should kind of inspire all of it, right? And that might be, the short tagline, there might be the 30-second elevator pitch, and then there might be, the somewhat lengthier story that you tell. And you may have a few anecdotes and a few facts and a few metrics that you pepper in there where it makes sense as well. But I like to think of it as a little bit of a pyramid. I mean, this is the same way kind of in journalism, people write their stories in the newspaper. It's kind of a pyramid, right? Like you start with the smallest piece that tells the story, and then you add more details and more details and more details. But each part of the way, you are sharing enough that somebody wants to read more. And that's the difference, I think, between how, your average person might start talking about the work that they do versus when they're trying to actually pitch somebody and hook them in. So you want to start with something that's interesting, that doesn't give it all away and makes someone go, tell me more. Oh, that's interesting, and begs more questions. Whereas, if you start in with the very rudimentary technical details of something, you've lost them already because you're starting at the bottom of the story. You need to start at the top. Why is it important? What's the hook? What's the thing that makes somebody think and gets them interested and is memorable, so that no matter what, when they walk away from that interaction, Dan's not the guy that works in software. Dan's the guy that is changing the way that, whatever it is. I don't know what you're working on these days or which projects you want to focus on, but, you can say, if you work for a payroll startup, we're getting everybody paid faster. That's cool. I want to get paid faster. Who doesn't? Oh, now we're talking about money and how that affects the bottom line and my life personally. That's really different from we're a payroll distribution software platform as a service, whatever, right? There's a different way of putting it that can be interesting to anybody and not just, the very specific potential customer that you may be talking to. I think it's important. Like, I think that, it may feel low value to tell your Uber driver exactly what it is that you're doing. But what that does is that's helping you practice for the next conversation and for the cocktail party where, you actually might run into somebody that is best friends with an investor that would be interested in you, or, you don't know, and you might happen to be talking to somebody who's very close to somebody that has decision-making power and might be a customer of yours. Every everybody that you talk to could be an unlock for something else in the future. And that gives you a chance to practice and pitch your story and try it again and tell it in a better way. And, you know, end up being, you know, the parent that the kid at school is actually very proud of what they do because they understand it. Even though they're only 5 and you work for a B2B SaaS company, but you were able to get the message across in a way that was compelling and it's memorable and makes people want to tell your story for you.
There was an element, Dorothy, of simplification that I heard in your answer. And I want to talk about a little bit. You mentioned, you know, the young kid, 3-year-old, 5-year-old, whatever you had just said. And I've always said, you need to be able to tell your story so that your grandmother or a 5-year-old at the Thanksgiving dinner table, when they ask you, so Dan, what are you doing? They understand. And I often see these founders and go to any website of any SaaS company or any tech company, and you'll see the words that you read them and you're like, wait, what's that? And you read it again. You're like, I still don't know what that means. And then you read it again and you're like, you know what? Forget it. And you're out. And then they can't understand why they have so much bounce off their homepage of their website. It's because no one knows what the fuck you're trying to say. And so part of what I was trying to do that night at that networking event was make it simple so that I can understand. I'll share a quick line for you, and then I would love your perspective on how you handle these founders when what they're telling you is just way too overcomplicated. So early in my career, I was selling advertising for a business-to-business publication, and my publisher, who was a pretty straightforward individual, said to me, Dan, your writing and your communication sucks. I was probably 24 years old. He said, I'm going to pay for you to go to take a class. And this was my first job in New York City. I'd moved there from Boston, and he said, I'll pay for it. So I went to NYU. I went to a night class, and I remember the professor. I won't name him because I still remember his name, and I still have his syllabus. And first night of class, he said, there are 2 types of communicators in this world. Those that take simple concepts and overcomplicate them, and those that take complicated concepts and simplify them. I'm going to teach you how to be the latter. And I thought, that's brilliant. So throughout my career, I've always remembered what he said, that professor, that night. I remember it vividly. And I always try to figure out how can I take the most complex thoughts that I think I have and just make them simple so that 5-year-old or that grandmother at the Thanksgiving dinner table knows what you're talking about. And I'm just curious, your perspective on that. You probably see it all the time. What coaching you give? Talk to me.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. I was reminded of this piece of advice I used to give my team when I was working in PR, and I managed, you know, a lot of other PR people, and we're all working in communications. We should all be excellent writers, but we struggle with it too. And the thing that I would tell people all the time was, okay, make it half the length and twice as vivid. And essentially what I'm telling them, this is too long and too boring, right? And if you can always cut down what you're doing, say what you're doing, say what you're trying to say with less words, and more powerful words, more vivid ones, more memorable ones, that's always going to get you farther, right? And so I was reminded of that recently because one of those women that I used to manage, she now, you know, runs communications for a big credit card company. And she said that, she said that somebody else was thanking her because she keeps giving them that same advice. And then she kind of credited me for that. And so we've been saying the same thing for, I don't know, 15, 20 years now, but half as long, twice as vivid. You want what you say to be repeatable. And that is the key, right? If you are always relying on yourself to tell your story and take 30 minutes to tell it, you are just not going to tell that many people what you're doing, right? But if you can do it, if you can nail it in 10, 15 seconds in such a way that everyone you say that to wants to tell other people that same thing, like, oh, I met this interesting person, or, oh, did you hear about this product? Or, I bought this thing because it sounded amazing. I got it. It's been amazing. I think you should get it too. When you get to that level where everybody else is doing the work for you, that's when you get exponential gains, right? And that's what great storytelling can get you.
I often find myself using this practice and coaching my sellers or my marketing people as well, which is once you tell your story, think ahead of time. Actually, let me rephrase that. Think ahead of time before you tell your story. What do I think the 2 or 3 key messages are going to be that this person shares with the next more important, perhaps, person that they tell it to? It could be their boss, the decision maker, whomever. What do you think they're going to say from your story? And if you stop and think about that, it can't be any more than 1 or 2 things, right? As you said before, hey, that guy Dan Hurwitz sells software that's going to get us paid faster. That's all you need to hear. I mean, done.
Yeah.
So I think that's really good advice, and yeah, I love to hear it.
And it takes practice. I think that is something that we can't overemphasize. I worked with a founder once who was just a media darling. He was everywhere. Everybody loved him. And he seemed like such a natural, right? Like he was such a great storyteller, so charismatic. Whenever he spoke, people listened. And I was shocked when actually we were having the company holiday party, and I pulled him aside and said, hey, you got to say something to the team, right? This is the moment. Everyone's here with their spouses and significant others. Like, you got to say something. Thank you. You got to pump them up. Like, this is the moment. And he was a little taken aback. He wasn't prepared for it. He wasn't expecting to, hadn't thought about it. And he went off in the corner and he was practicing what he was going to say to his team. And I was so surprised by this because I was fooled too. I thought he was a natural. And even he would practice before speaking to his own team, right? And it's like the cadence of what he was saying and the words. And he was back there saying, okay, welcome to our 8th annual holiday party. Like he's even the cadence of it, right? The tempo and how he was the rise and the fall. And so that struck me, because there's so many people out there who don't feel like they're a natural storyteller. And they're not putting in nearly as much time as he is into his storytelling, right? And so that chasm is going to get so wide and so deep. If you're not putting the time in, you are not going to be able to tell as compelling as a story as the next person. And that's the important thing you have to know. If you're raising money, if you are talking to customers, everybody's getting bombarded by messages from all directions. You at that party, Dan, as an investor, people are pitching you. Yeah, if they're telling a dry story, it's going to be hard for you to keep paying attention and look for the nuggets. So what people have to do is deliver those nuggets to you, right? They have to practice it. They have to try it out, test it with other people, test it on themselves, everybody they know, and practice until they get really good at it so that they stand out. Then you want to hear more.
Love it. Love the whole storytelling thing. I'm going to dial us back and ask a final question to sum up the whole conversation. So you see hundreds, if not thousands, of pitches from startups, early stage, startup founders from all walks of life, whether it be commercial, technical, cause oriented. What's the number one piece of advice that you'd give a founder in their early stages if they were sitting down to meet with you, asking you for money or just support in some way or advice? What would be that message?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a lot of different pieces of advice in one, and we've talked about a lot of it already. But what it boils down to is know who you're talking to, why they should care, and then deliver them an authentic message and tell a good story that's true to you. That's kind of, at the end of the day, what you're trying to do. And it's so easy to lose track of that. When somebody asks you, hey, what do you do? Or what's your pitch? You have to go back to that and go through, quickly go through those steps in your mind. Who am I talking to? Why should they care? Okay, how am I going to tell this in a way that matters? It's going to go through. It's going to get through to them. They're going to remember and they're going to want to repeat it. You have to take the time beforehand to know what that is that you're going to say and practice it so that when they ask that question, you don't have to think through all those steps again in the moment. You've already done the work and you know exactly what you're going to say. You can do it cold. But yeah, I think it's all of those things, like know who you're going to talk to, know who you're talking to, know what they're going to care about, and tell that story in a way that's authentic to you. And that's going to be memorable and repeatable.
Great advice. Fantastic. Dorothy, if you wouldn't mind, share with the audience, how do people get in touch with you? What's the best way to seek out and work with and network with Dorothy Chang?
Yeah, you can email me anytime. I'm Dorothy, Dorothy, at Lynx Collective. Lynx is the animal, Lynx collective.com. You can also follow me on Twitter. I'm at DJ, the letters DJ. Don't message me there though, because I have a lot of weird notifications all the time.
No.
I mean, people are trying to, mention their favorite DJ and that goes to me because they put spaces in whatever. It's weird. I can't read my mentions at all, but you can follow me there and then email me.
Sounds great. Well, thank you for being on my show. I really appreciate it. Your insight is super valuable and have a great day.
Thanks for having me.
Okay.